Tonight's story is a gentle journey into the high mountains, the deep valleys, and the timeless spirit of a land called Nepal. You are safe now. The night is calm. The world outside can wait. Let your breath soften. Feel your body resting, and let your mind drift. Imagine you are wrapped in warmth, as though under a blanket of Himalayan clouds, cool and pure. We will go back in time, far back into myth and memory, to walk slowly through the winding paths of history. Close your eyes. Listen to the hush of silence between each word. The mountains rise before us, snow-tipped and eternal, their shadows stretching across the earth like guardians of dreams. And in this timeless stillness, our story begins. Long ago, before cities, before kingdoms, the Kathmandu Valley was said to be no valley at all. Legends whisper that it was once a vast, glimmering lake, its waters deep and still, cradled by the encircling ridges. Fishermen's boats would glide over its mirrored surface, and in the evenings, the setting sun would scatter gold across the waves. But this lake was not destined to last. In Buddhist tradition, it was the enlightened being Manjushri, the bodhisattva of wisdom, who looked upon the lake and saw its hidden promise. With a single stroke of his sword, he is said to have cut through the gorge at Chober, letting the waters rush out in a mighty torrent. The lake drained, and in its fertile bed, a valley was revealed, a valley destined to hold cities, temples, and generations of life. Even now, when one walks through the Chober Gorge, it is said, you can feel the echo of that ancient flood. A hush in the air, like the afterbreath of creation. The earliest peoples who wandered into this new valley left little behind but stone tools and faint traces in caves. Archaeologists have found relics in places like the Dang Valley and near the banks of ancient rivers, signs that human footsteps touched these lands thousands upon thousands of years ago. These were small bands of gatherers and hunters, their lives shaped by the rhythm of seasons, the flow of rivers, and the endless mountains around them. Imagine their nights, a fire glowing in the dark, smoke curling toward the starlit sky, the sound of distant wolves, the cold wind pressing at their shelters. Their lives were simple, but they began a chain that would never be broken, the chain of people who would call this land home. In time, the Karate people emerged, their name echoing through the early legends of Nepal. The Karatis were said to be fierce hunters, skilled with bow and arrow, their bodies strong, their spirits tied to the forest and mountain. They became rulers of the valley, passing down stories of a long line of kings, 28 in number, if the chronicles are to be believed. Among them was King Yalambar, remembered in folklore as both a warrior and a figure woven into the grander tales of India. Some say he was present in the epic age of the Mahabharata, fighting alongside great heroes, his name echoing even beyond the snowy peaks. The Kiratas left behind their mark not only in story, but in custom. They built shrines to nature spirits, practiced rituals to honor the unseen world, and slowly began weaving the threads of society. The valley was fertile, its soil dark and rich from the old lake, and soon rice paddies shimmered under the sun. Buffaloes grazed, children ran barefoot through fields, and the outlines of villages took shape against the rolling hills. But the valley was never isolated, not truly. Even in those earliest centuries, traders and wanderers passed through, carrying salt, spices, and cloth from the plains of India, or wool and turquoise from the Tibetan plateau. Nepal, perched between great civilizations, became a passageway, a land of meeting. Imagine the sound of an ancient caravan arriving at dawn, the bray of yaks, the jingle of bells on harnesses, the murmurs of men speaking different tongues, the smell of butter tea mixing with smoke from village hearths. These caravans were like veins, carrying not only goods, but ideas, prayers, and stories. And so, as centuries turned like pages, Nepal became more than a land of hunters and farmers. It became a land of shrines, where stones were raised and carved with images of deities, where the air trembled with chants carried from India, where Buddhism and Hinduism both found fertile ground. The people of the valley learned to build not only with wood and thatch, but with stone and brick, shaping sanctuaries that would endure. Small temples rose on hilltops, prayer flags fluttered in the breeze, and festivals began festivals that still glow in Kathmandu's streets today. Lanterns swinging, drums beating, dancers moving as though in communion with centuries past. This was a time of beginnings, when myth and memory blurred. To sleep and dream of Nepal's earliest age is to drift through a world where lakes drained by gods became valleys of rice, where hunters became kings, and where the first echoes of religion, trade, and community stirred like the faintest hum of a dawn yet to come. The Himalayas stood silent and unchanged, but below them, the human heart began its endless rhythm, beating in temples, in farms, in caravans moving slowly through misty passes. The valley, once ruled by Kirati hunters and kings, slowly shifted into a new age of writing, temples, and carved stone. Around the 4th century of our era, the Lichavi dynasty rose to prominence, and with them, Nepal's first recorded history began to glow upon the earth like inscriptions lit by candlelight. The earliest stone pillars and copper plates from this period still stand, their letters curling in the ancient script of Gupta influence. Their words preserving decrees of kings and endowments to temples. Imagine, if you will, a stonemason carving patiently into cool rock, his chisel striking softly, each mark holding the promise of permanence. Those letters, etched more than 1,000 years ago, still whisper today of rulers, donations, and the pious acts that wove society together. It was under the Lichavis that Nepal's voice began to speak clearly to history. The rulers of this time, beginning with King Supashpa and later kings like Amshuverma, were remembered as patrons of both faith and state. Amshuverma, in particular, shines in chronicles as a wise and capable ruler of the 7th century, balancing politics with culture. He strengthened the kingdom with roads and alliances, and his court became a place of learning. Foreign envoys, even from distant China, walked through the valley's narrow streets to sit before him. Their scrolls record Nepal not as a hidden land, but as a center of trade and diplomacy, its rulers both proud and astute. Religion blossomed here in a unique harmony. Hinduism and Buddhism did not clash, but intertwined like twin rivers flowing side by side. Temples to Vishnu rose near stupas, honoring the Buddha. Pilgrims wandered the valley, their prayers drifting upward like incense smoke, mingling in the still Himalayan air. The great stupa of Swayambhunath, perched on its hilltop, took on new adornments, its eyes painted with watchful calm, gazing out over the valley. Below, the great tree-shaded sanctuaries of Pashupatinath echoed with bells and chants, a site sacred to Lord Shiva. Imagine the sound drums reverberating, conch shells blowing, mantras chanted in Sanskrit, while prayer flags rustled like whispers of eternity. It was also a time of architecture and art, the newer artisans of the valley, inheritors of both Kirati traditions and Indian influences, began to shape a style uniquely Nepali. Wood was carved with delicate care into latticed windows, each piece like lace cut from dark timber. Brick temples rose in the stepped, pagoda-style architectural form that would later travel beyond Nepal, influencing Tibet and even China. The tiered roofs, each level crowned with a golden finial, seemed to mirror the layered ridges of the mountains around them. Trade thrived as Nepal stood between great civilizations. Caravans wound down from Tibet, bearing salt, wool, and precious turquoise. From the south came spices, cotton, and manuscripts. The Silk Road brushed against Nepal's borders, and its merchants became skilled in the art of exchange. Not only goods, but stories and rituals crossed the passes. Buddhist monks from India carried scriptures northward to Tibet, sometimes stopping in the monasteries of Nepal to copy them by hand. Nepal became both a bridge and a sanctuary. a resting point for travelers moving between the Great Plains and the high plateau. Amid this, daily life in the valley had its own rhythm. Farmers tended terraced fields where rice paddies glistened under the monsoon sun, their emerald green reflecting like glass. Women carried baskets of vegetables to bustling markets, while potters shaped clay vessels on spinning wheels, their hands steady and practiced. Children played in courtyards, their laughter mingling with the lowing of cattle. In the evenings, oil lamps flickered before household shrines, casting long shadows across mud-brick walls. The valley was alive with color, sound, and devotion. It is said that during the Lichvi period, Nepal produced some of the finest stone sculptures in South Asia. Smooth, dark images of Vishnu reclining upon the serpent Shisha, or Buddha seated in meditation, were carved with precision and grace. These images, still preserved in temples and museums, hold an otherworldly calm, their faces serene, their hands frozen in mudras of blessing. To stand before one is to feel time slow, to sense the same peace felt by worshippers centuries ago, kneeling before those very forms. Perhaps one of the most curious tales of this era is the marriage alliance between Nepal and Tibet. Princess Brikuti, daughter of a Lichvi king, was sent north as a bride to the Tibetan emperor Songtsen Gampo in the 7th century. Legends say she carried with her sacred images of the Buddha, introducing them to Tibet, where they became treasured icons. In this way, Nepalese influence seeped deep into Tibetan Buddhism, its art and devotion forever marked by the hand of a princess from the Kathmandu Valley. The Lichvi era was also one of literacy and learning. Sanskrit flourished in inscriptions and manuscripts, and the courts became places where poets recited verses and scholars debated philosophy. Schools attached to monasteries and temples trained novices in chanting and scripture. One can imagine the scene: a candle-lit hall, young monks bent over palm leaf manuscripts, their voices murmuring sutras, the scratching of reed pens steady in the quiet. Knowledge became as valued as stone or gold, its light spreading from the valley outward. But time is never still. The Lichvi dynasty, strong for centuries, eventually began to weaken. Local lords grew more powerful, and by the 8th century, the great dynasty faded, leaving its temples, inscriptions, and legends behind. Yet their legacy had shaped the valley into a cradle of art, faith, and exchange. What had begun as a drained lake had now become a true jewel of the Himalayas, glowing with culture, faith, and beauty. The centuries turned like the slow unfurling of prayer flags in the wind, and after the quiet fading of the Lichvi line, a new dynasty rose in the valley, the Malla rulers whose reign stretched from the 12th century into the 18th. Their name, Malla, meaning wrestler, echoed strength and vitality. But their legacy was one of art, architecture, and intricate devotion. Under their hands, the three great cities of the valley, Kathmandu, Patan, and Bokto became living masterpieces, their streets filled with temples, palaces, and festivals that glowed with timeless wonder. Imagine walking through Bokto in the 15th century. The air is scented with incense, and the sound of drums rolls across narrow brick lanes. The marketplace is alive with merchants, women selling baskets of rice, craftsmen displaying copper pots, weavers arranging dyed fabrics in shades of crimson and saffron. Children run past with kites made of paper and bamboo, their laughter chasing them like the wind. And above it all rise the tiered roofs of pagoda temples, each level edged with wooden carvings of deities, demons, and animals, all watching with carved eyes as life flows below. The Malla kings were not only rulers, but patrons of beauty. Each competed with the others to outshine rival cities, pouring wealth into the construction of temples, palaces, and monuments. The result was a valley studded with treasures. In Kathmandu's Durbar Square, the royal palace rose with courtyards and windows carved like lace. In Patan, golden spires crowned the Mahabuddha temple, its surface covered with thousands of small, hand-sculpted Buddhas. In Bhaktapur, the Nyatapala temple soared with 5 sweeping tiers, each roof guarded by colossal stone figures, wrestlers, elephants, lions, griffins, and goddesses standing watch, as though to shield the sacred heart of the city. Religion during the Malla period was a vibrant fusion. Hinduism and Buddhism coexisted as in earlier centuries. But now their blending became deeply woven into festivals, rituals, and even art. A temple might be dedicated to Vishnu, yet adorned with images of the Buddha. A Buddhist stupa might host rituals honoring Hindu deities. The valley's newer people perfected this balance, their culture alive with daily offerings, sacred dances, and masked dramas. Festivals glowed like jewels in the calendar, their rhythms unchanged even today. Indra Jaitra, held in Kathmandu, filled the streets with processions, masked dancers, and the living goddess, the Kumari, carried in a golden chariot. The Kumari, a young girl believed to embody divine power, gazed down upon the crowd, her face calm yet radiant as people bowed in reverence. In Bhaktapur, the biscuit Jaitra celebrated the new year with towering chariots dragged through the streets by roaring crowds, their wooden wheels groaning as ropes strained, the air filled with shouts, drums, and firelight. These were not just rituals, they were the heartbeat of the valley, binding communities together across centuries. Artisans flourished under royal patronage. Metal workers hammered bronze and copper into bells, statues, and ritual vessels. Each piece polished until it gleamed like liquid fire. Painters created pabha scrolls, precursors to Tibetan thankos. Their pigments made from crushed minerals and plants, their images alive with gods and mandalos. Stone carvers shaped fountains, spouts, and sculptures of serpents and deities, placing them in courtyards where water still trickles today. To walk through the valley in the Malla age was to step inside a living gallery where every corner, every alley seemed to hold art touched by divine hands. The kings themselves left their marks not only in stone but in chronicles. One of the most remarkable was King Jayostidi Malla, who, in the 14th century, reformed society with a strict caste system, codifying roles for craftsmen, priests, and farmers. Though rigid, his system gave structure to the growing cities, shaping how people lived, worked, and worshipped. Later, King Pratap Malla of Kathmandu in the 17th century became known for his poetry, his learning, and his restless energy. He inscribed his name in Sanskrit, Persian, and even Latin upon stone slabs, eager to leave a mark in many tongues. He commissioned the construction of the Rani Pokhari, a serene pond in the heart of Kathmandu, built in memory of his beloved queen, its waters reflecting temples and stars alike. Trade once again tied Nepal to its neighbors. From India came cotton, indigo, and manuscripts. From Tibet came salt, wool, and gold dust carried in leather bags. Nepalese merchants traveled north and south, their caravans winding along narrow mountain passes, their bells jingling, their yaks carrying loads across snow and stone. They brought not only wealth, but connections, linking Nepal to great centers of Buddhism in Tibet and the vast plains of the Mughal Empire in India. The valley grew rich, its temples plated with gilded copper, its palaces adorned with treasures from abroad. Life for the common people was simpler, yet tied deeply to the grandeur around them. Farmers tended rice, millet, and barley on terraced hillsides that wrapped the mountains like steps to the sky. Families gathered in courtyards to pound grain with heavy wooden pestles, the rhythmic thuds echoing across rooftops. Musicians played flutes, drums, and stringed instruments at feasts, while masked dancers performed the stories of gods and demons in flickering torchlight. Nights glowed with oil lamps, their flames dancing against carved wood and brick, as chants from nearby temples filled the air with a steady hum of devotion. Yet, even in this age of splendor, shadows grew. Rivalries between the three Malla kingdoms deepened, and their constant competition left them divided. Though their cities shone with beauty, their unity weakened. As centuries passed, the Malla rulers grew vulnerable to the rising power of outsiders. To the west, a small but ambitious kingdom in Gorkha was watching, preparing, waiting for its chance. But for now, in the Malla centuries, Nepal was a kingdom of festivals, temples, and unbroken artistry. Its cities became jewels nestled in the lap of the Himalayas, glowing with devotion and beauty. To dream of this age is to see golden spires catching the first rays of dawn, to hear drums echo across courtyards at dusk, to feel the quiet strength of artisans chiseling stone by lantern light, knowing their work would outlast their own lifetimes. And as the stars turn above us, the story of the Mallas settles softly into Memorian era of light, devotion, and delicate beauty, shimmering eternally in the heart of the Kathmandu Valley. The Malla kings had built temples that kissed the sky and cities that glittered like jewels. Yet their rivalry left them divided, fragile, and unprepared for the storm that gathered in the west. High in the rugged hills, where terraced fields clung to steep slopes and fortresses crowned stony ridges, there lay the small but ambitious kingdom of Gorkha. It was not wealthy, nor as splendid as the Kathmandu Valley, yet its people were hardy, accustomed to the discipline of mountain life, and its rulers carried a vision that stretched beyond their narrow valleys. From this land would rise a man who dreamed of a single, united Nepal. His name was Prithvi Narayan Shah, born in 1723. Prithvi Narayan grew up amid the murmurs of soldiers sharpening swords and elders speaking of conquest. Gorkha was small, but he believed it could be great. And as he watched the fractured Malla kingdoms bicker among themselves, he saw an opportunity. The Kathmandu Valley, with its fertile plains, bustling markets, and sacred temples, was the heart of Nepal, but it was weak in its disunity. If one kingdom could control it, the foundation for a strong nation could be laid. Prithvi Narayan was patient. He studied his enemies, their walls, their alliances, their weaknesses. He understood that the key to unification was not brute force alone, but strategies, ply lines, sieges, and the gradual encirclement of his rivals. He strengthened Gorkha's armies, training them to march across mountain passes, to fight not just with swords, but with cunning. He secured alliances with neighboring states and ensured the loyalty of his people. Slowly, steadily, he moved his pieces across the board of the Himalayas. In 1744, he made his first great strike, capturing New Wakat, a fortress town that guarded the trade route between Tibet and the Kathmandu Valley. The victory was not merely military. It was economic, for by seizing New Wakat, he cut into the lifeline of the Malla kings. From there, his influence spread like ripples in water, each conquest bringing him closer to the heart of the valley. The Malla rulers, though wealthy, struggled to resist. They were caught in their rivalries, unable to unite even against this rising power. Bhaktapur Patan and Kathmandu remained separate, and though their festivals still filled the streets with light and music, shadows of uncertainty crept into their courts. Merchants whispered of the Gorkhali threat, priests prayed for divine intervention, and soldiers braced for the inevitable clash. The campaigns of Prithvi Narayan were relentless but measured. He adopted siege tactics, cutting off supplies to starve his enemies into submission rather than destroying their cities outright. In 1768, after years of maneuvering, he struck decisively at Kathmandu. The city, unprepared and weakened, fell to his forces. That same year, he captured Patan, and in 1769, after a fierce struggle, he claimed Bhaktapur as well. The three jewels of the valley, once rivals, now gleamed together under his crown. With these victories, Prithvi Narayan Shah declared the foundation of a unified Nepal. It was not yet the Nepal we know today, but it was the seed from which it would grow. He established Kathmandu as his capital, recognizing its centrality and wealth. He respected its temples and shrines, ensuring that the sanctity of the valley was preserved. Yet he also tightened his grip, aware that unity required not only vision but discipline. Prithvi Narayan was more than a conqueror. He was a strategist who understood the delicate balance between his fragile new state and the powerful neighbors that surrounded it. To the south lay the Mughal Empire's successor states and, increasingly, the expanding influence of the British East India Company. To the north lay Tibet, and beyond it, the vastness of the Qing dynasty in China. Nepal was small, but its location was a crossroads, a place of danger and opportunity. In his wisdom, he declared that Nepal should remain isolated from foreign powers, cautious of entanglements that could threaten its sovereignty. He likened his country to a yam caught between two boulders, India to the south and China to the north. This image, simple yet profound, would echo through the centuries, capturing the delicate reality of Nepal's geopolitical position. Life in the new Gorkhali state was not easy. Prithvi Narayan imposed discipline and reorganization. Trade routes were secured, forts were strengthened, and taxation was reorganized to sustain the army. Villagers across the hills contributed grain and labor, their sweat and toil fueling the growth of a kingdom. Though strict, his rule planted the foundations of stability that allowed the dream of Nepal to survive. Even as he expanded his borders, he respected the spiritual traditions of the valley. He supported both Hindu and Buddhist institutions, ensuring continuity amid change. The festivals of Indra Jatra, Biscuit Jatra, and others continued, though now under the watchful eye of Gorkhali soldiers. The living goddess, Kumari, still emerged in her golden chariot, her calm gaze passing over crowds that now whispered of the new order. The temples still rang with bells and conchs, their sounds blending with the tramp of boots and the clang of swords. By the time of his death in 1775, Prithvi Narayan Shah had laid the foundations of a kingdom that stretched far beyond the little hills of Gorkha. He had taken the dream of unity and carved it into reality, a vision that his successors would carry forward, though not without struggle. The Malla age of splendor had ended, and a new age of kingship had begun, one forged in conquest, but guided by foresight. And so as the night deepens, we can almost hear the footsteps of Gorkhali soldiers marching through misty mountain passes, the clang of weapons echoing against stone walls, and the soft rustle of parchment as Prithvi Narayan recorded his thoughts for future generations. His dream was simple, yet immense, that the scattered lands of the Himalayas might become one. A single Nepal, standing strong between giants. The stars above the valley bore silent witness as the torch of history passed from the delicate artistry of the Mallas to the iron will of the Shahs. The rivers that wound through terraced fields reflected a new order, steady yet fragile, bound together by the determination of a mountain king whose vision would shape centuries to come. The dream of unity did not end with Prithvi Narayan Shah. Though his passing in 1775 left his successors to grapple with a fragile inheritance. Nepal was larger than ever, but unity was still new, and ambition pulled its borders outward like a flame reaching for the sky. His descendants, the Shah kings, sought to expand the kingdom, sending armies westward into the rugged hills, eastward into fertile valleys, and southward toward the plains of India. For a time, Nepal stretched across a vast arc of the Himalayas, from the banks of the Sutlej River in the west to the banks of the Tista in the east. It was a realm as dramatic as the mountains themselves, fierce and breathtaking. Yet its growth would soon collide with powers greater than its own. The British East India Company, that restless merchant empire which had already claimed Bengal and was extending its reach across India, saw in Nepal both a challenge and an opportunity. The Gorkhali armies were formidable, trained in mountain warfare, their soldiers renowned for bravery and endurance. Known later as Gorkhas, these warriors earned respect even from their enemies. Yet Nepal's expanding borders pressed against British-controlled lands, and friction turned into sparks of conflict. By 1814, those sparks ignited into the Anglo-Nepalese War, a struggle fought across ridges and valleys, where muskets echoed against cliffs and drums, rolled through forests of pine and oak, The Gorakhali commanders, most famously Amar Singh Thapa, resisted with tenacity, fortifying hilltop forts and ambushing British columns along narrow trails. Tales spread of Gorkha soldiers who fought until the last breath, their kukri blades flashing like lightning in the mist. The British, though surprised by their adversaries' valor, pressed forward with their superior resources and endless reinforcements. After 2 years of grueling combat, the conflict ended with the Treaty of Sugali in 1816. Nepal was forced to cede vast territories: Kumaon, Garhwal, Sikkim, and much of the Terai Plains. The once vast dream of a Himalayan empire contracted sharply, leaving Nepal smaller but still sovereign. Yet, from the ashes of defeat arose something unexpected: respect. The British, impressed by the courage of Nepalese soldiers, began recruiting them into their own ranks. Thus began the long tradition of Gurkha regiments. Soldiers who would march beneath foreign banners, yet carry the spirit of the Himalayas into distant wars. The Shah monarchy remained, but its power grew fragile. Court intrigues, rivalries among nobles, and shifting alliances left the kingdom unstable. In 1846, this turbulence erupted into one of the most infamous nights in Nepalese history: the Khat massacre. Within the royal armory in Kathmandu, a quarrel spiraled into violence. From the chaos emerged Jung Bahadur Rana, a soldier of ambition and cunning, who seized control of the government and established a new order. The Rana regime, which he founded, would dominate Nepal for over a century. Though the Shah kings remained on the throne, they became little more than ceremonial figures, while true power rested in the hands of the Rana prime ministers. The Ranas ruled with iron discipline, styling themselves as hereditary rulers, passing authority from uncle to nephew in an unbroken chain. Young Bahadur Rana wasted no time consolidating his control. He traveled to Britain in 1850, the first high-ranking Nepalese to visit Europe. There he saw railways steaming across green landscapes, factories roaring with iron, and cities glittering with gas lamps. The Industrial Revolution had reshaped the world, and though Nepal remained secluded, Jung Bahadur grasped the scale of foreign power. Returning home, he tightened Nepal's isolation. Wary of foreign influence, yet adopted reforms inspired by what he had seen. He codified Nepal's legal system in the Muluki Ain, a law code that sought to bring order to social classes and justice, though it also preserved the rigid caste divisions that define daily life. The Kathmandu Valley, under the Ranas, shimmered with new palaces. Inspired by European architecture, they built sprawling residences with tall white columns, vast courtyards, and chandeliers that glittered like starlight. The contrast was striking outside. The valley still flowed with farmers tending rice terraces, artisans carving wood and stone, and pilgrims circling ancient stupas. Inside these new palaces, crystal glass and imported carpets spoke of another world. It was as if the Himalayas themselves had borrowed the language of distant empires. Yet the Ranas, for all their grandeur, were wary of progress that might weaken their hold. Education remained limited, trade was controlled, and ordinary people had little voice in the affairs of state. Nepal, caught in the embrace of tradition and the grip of hereditary rulers, seemed frozen in time, even as the world around it spun toward modernity. Still, the people endured, finding rhythm in their timeless cycles. Farmers sowed and harvested, their terraces glistening with water under the sun. Traders carried salt, wool, and grain across high passes, their caravans winding like threads between Tibet and India. Priests lit butter lamps in shrines that had stood for centuries, their chants rising into cold morning air. Life continued beneath the shadow of the palaces, just as it always had, rooted in the soil and in the faith of the mountains. The Ranas maintained a careful balance with the British, neither conquered nor entirely free. Nepal provided soldiers for Britain's colonial wars, India in Burma, and even as far as the trenches of Europe during the First World War. Gurkhas earned a reputation for loyalty and fearlessness, and their service brought prestige, though the wealth flowed more to the Rana elite than to the common families who gave their sons to distant battles. By the late 19th century, Nepal stood apart, a land of contrasts, isolated yet entangled, ancient yet touched by the modern, ruled by a dynasty of prime ministers who cloaked themselves in both tradition and imported grandeur. In the quiet alleys of Kathmandu, whispers stirred of change, yet the grip of the Ranas held firm, their lineage seeming unshakable, their palaces like marble fortresses against the tide of time. And so, as the moonlight drifts across the tiled roofs of Patam and the carved struts of Bhaktapur's temples, we can feel the duality of Nepal in this age, the timeless heartbeat of its people, steady and enduring, and the heavy silence of a regime that sought to hold the future at bay. Beneath the stillness, currents moved unseen, carrying the kingdom toward the dawn of a new century, where change, long suppressed, would awaken once more. The 20th century arrived like the slow dawn over the Himalayas, its first light brushing the peaks while the valleys still lingered in shadow. In Nepal, the Ranas remained in control, their palaces gleaming with imported chandeliers and marble staircases, their authority stretching across the hills and plains. Yet beyond their borders, the world was shifting in ways that no walls, however tall, could fully keep out. The people of Nepal, bound to their land and their traditions, lived much as their ancestors had. Farmers still plowed terraces with wooden tools drawn by oxen, their fields shimmering with rice seedlings in the summer rains. In courtyards, women spun thread and pounded grain, while children played with clay figures and bamboo toys. Priests and monks carried on rituals unchanged for centuries, their chants rising in temples fragrant with incense and butter lamps. The timeless rhythm of daily life gave the appearance of stillness, but beneath it, the faint hum of change began to stir. The Ranas, cautious of foreign influence, limited education to the elite. Schools were few, books rare, and for most Nepalese, literacy was a distant dream. Yet, even within this isolation, curiosity could not be completely contained. Traders carried stories along with their goods. Soldiers returning from service in distant lands brought glimpses of other worlds. And a quiet restlessness took root in the younger generation. The world came closer still with the outbreak of World War I in 1914. Nepal, though isolated, was bound to Britain through the tradition of Gurkha service. Thousands of Nepalese soldiers marched into foreign wars, fighting in muddy trenches in France, in deserts of the Middle East, and in jungles of Southeast Asia. They carried with them not only kukri knives and rifles, but also the unyielding endurance of mountain people. For their valor, they earned medals, honors, and renown. And though much of the material reward flowed to the Rana elite, the experience planted seeds of awareness. Those who returned spoke of vast cities, of machines that roared like thunder, of ideas, of freedom and equality. In 1923, a treaty with Britain formally recognized Nepal as an independent nation, distinct from the Indian subcontinent, affirming sovereignty that had already been fiercely defended. Yet independence in name was not freedom for its people. The Rana's grip remained heavy, their rule hereditary, their palaces filled with wealth, while villages remained bound by hardship. Still, the winds of change were whispering through the passes. The 1930s and 1940s deepened these currents. The world once again plunged into war with the outbreak of World War II. Nepal contributed more soldiers to the Allied effort. Over 200,000 Gurkhas served across Europe, Africa, and Asia, their courage becoming legendary. They fought in the deserts of North Africa, in the jungles of Burma, and on the beaches of Italy, earning respect and fear in equal measure. The cost was heavy. Many did not return, but those who did carried back new perspectives, glimpses of democratic systems, and the belief that their own homeland might one day change. At home, the Rana regime tightened its control, but cracks began to appear. The global tide of decolonization after 1945. As nations from India to Indonesia sought freedom from imperial rule, inspired Nepalese intellectuals and activists. Many young Nepalese studied or worked in India, where they encountered the Indian independence movement led by Gandhi, Nehru, and others. They saw a neighboring nation rise up to claim its destiny, and the contrast with their own country's stasis became unbearable. Out of these stirrings emerged the Nepali Congress Party, founded in 1946 by leaders such as Bishwish, War Prasad, Korala. It was a movement calling for democracy, for education, for a government chosen by the people rather than imposed by hereditary rulers. Though small at first, its message spread like quiet fire, carried in whispers across tea shops, in secret pamphlets passed hand to hand, in the conversations of students and returning soldiers. The Rana rulers, sensing the tremors, clung to tradition. They built more palaces, enforced censorship, and sought to suppress dissent. Yet their efforts could not stop the shifting tide. King Tribhuvan, a Shah monarch reduced to a figurehead, began to sympathize with the democratic cause. Though his power was limited, his symbolic support mattered, and it would soon become the fulcrum upon which Nepal's destiny turned. The 1940s also brought subtle cultural shifts. Despite restrictions, literature and journalism began to stir. Writers like Lakshmi, Prasad, Devkota composed poetry that spoke of freedom, beauty, and human dignity. Their words slipping past the barriers of censorship to inspire imaginations. In hidden corners, small presses printed newspapers that challenged Rana authority, while songs carried through festivals hinted at a longing for change. Meanwhile, the everyday life of Nepal's people remained a blend of hardship and resilience. The mountains continue to echo with the sound of shepherds calling to their flocks, of women singing as they transplanted rice seedlings, of bells ringing in monasteries perched high above the clouds. The rivers still roared through gorges, carrying stories from village to village, and the snow peaks stood eternal, silent witnesses to the slow march of history. Yet beneath this constancy, the human spirit leaned forward, straining toward a dawn that seemed close enough to touch. By the late 1940s, Nepal's destiny was entangled with that of India, which won independence in 1947. The collapse of British rule in the subcontinent sent ripples across the Himalayas. Indian leaders encouraged Nepalese activists, and many exiles found refuge across the border, plotting the future from cities like Calcutta and Benares. The example was powerful. If India could rise against centuries of imperial rule, could Nepal not rise against a century of autocracy? The Ranas could feel the ground shifting beneath them, though they did not yet fall. The palaces of Singha Durbar and Narayan Hidi still glowed with chandeliers, but outside their gates, the murmur of dissent was growing louder. The mountains, timeless and immense, seemed to lean closer, listening, as if aware that their valleys would soon echo with the voices of change. And so, as the stars wheel above Nepal in the mid-20th century, we stand at the threshold of a turning point. The Ranas still hold power. The Shah king still sits in symbolic silence, and the people still toil in terraces. Yet, the currents of war, independence, and new ideas swirl around them. The night is deep, but the horizon glimmers faintly with a promise of a new dawn. One carried on the whispers of democracy and the restless hearts of those who dreamed of freedom. The late 1940s carried with them a restlessness that no palace gates could silence. Across Nepal, the whispers of democracy were spreading, carried on the voices of students, returning soldiers, and exiles who had glimpsed freedom abroad. Ranas, still cloaked in the grandeur of their white-columned palaces, ruled as they had for a century. Yet the ground beneath their feet was shifting. At the center of this transformation stood King Tribhuvan, a quiet monarch whose role had long been ceremonial under Rana dominance. Born into the Shah dynasty, he had grown up within the gilded cage of their power, paraded in rituals, but denied true authority. Yet, as he watched the world change the independence of India, the rise of democratic movements, he began to see himself as more than a figurehead. Within his reserved demeanor lay a willingness to align with those who dreamed of a freer Nepal. The opposition coalesced around the Nepali Congress Party, founded by Bishwesh War, Prasad Koirala, and other visionaries who sought an end to Rana autocracy. From exile in India, they organized, strategized, and built networks across the border, drawing inspiration from the independent struggle that had just triumphed there. Their aim was clear: to replace Rana rule with a system where power belonged not to a hereditary clique, but to the people. The tension came to a breaking point in 1950. That year, King Tribhuvan made a bold move. With the help of Nepali Congress leaders and Indian sympathizers, he fled the tightly guarded palaces of Kathmandu and sought refuge in the Indian embassy. From there, he was flown to New Delhi, leaving behind his people but not abandoning them. His escape was a statement, a declaration that the king no longer stood with the Ranas, but with the cause of democracy. The Ranas, stunned but unwilling to yield, attempted to maintain control. They placed Tribhuvan's young grandson, Gyanendra, on the throne, hoping to project continuity. But the world had changed, and so had the people. Armed uprisings broke out across Nepal, led by Nepali Congress fighters who attacked Rana outposts and seized territory in the Terai Plains. Villages lit fires of rebellion, their cries echoing against the hills. The Ranas found themselves besieged not only by rebels but by the political pressure of India, which refused to recognize their puppet king and supported Tribhuvan as the rightful monarch. In February 1951, the long Rana century came to an end. Negotiations in New Delhi led to a tripartite agreement between King Tribhuvan, the Nepali Congress, and the Ranas. Tribhuvan returned to Kathmandu in triumph. Greeted by cheering crowds who filled the streets, their voices rising like a flood of hope. The Ranas, though stripped of absolute power, were allowed to retain certain privileges, but the age of their unchallenged dominance was over. It was a moment of profound transition. For the first time in centuries, Nepal was free of the shadow of hereditary prime ministers. The Shah monarch regained authority, but more importantly, the idea of popular governance began to breathe. Tribhuvan promised his people a new future, one in which democracy would take root. A coalition government was formed, blending royalists, Democrats, and remnants of the Rana establishment. The path ahead was uncertain, but the gates of change had opened. The early years of this new era were fragile, filled with both promise and turbulence. The institutions of democracy, parliament, political parties, a free press were newborn, delicate as saplings in rocky soil. Leaders of the Nepali Congress, including Maitrika Prasad Koirala, began to hold office, though their authority was often challenged by royal influence and the entrenched habits of hierarchy. King Tribhuvan himself did not live long to see these experiments unfold. In 1955, he passed away, and his son, King Mahendra, ascended the throne. Mahendra inherited a nation both hopeful and unsettled, where democracy had been declared but had yet to be deeply rooted. The people, weary of centuries of autocracy, were eager for change, yet the institutions to support it were fragile. During these years, Nepal cautiously began to open itself to the outside world. For the first time, foreign embassies appeared in Kathmandu. Roads were constructed to connect the valley to the plains, and international aid trickled in. Visitors from abroad marveled at a land that seemed to straddle two ages. Ancient temples where priests chanted in Sanskrit, and new radios crackling with voices from distant lands. The isolation that had defined Nepal for centuries was slowly giving way to engagement. Education, once restricted, began to expand. Schools were established, literacy campaigns launched, and young Nepalese found themselves with opportunities that their parents had never known. A new generation, curious and ambitious, began to emerge, dreaming of futures not bound by fields or palaces, but by possibilities of their own making. Yet, even as the promise of democracy glimmered, challenges loomed. Political parties quarreled, corruption seeped into the fragile institutions, and the balance of power between king, parliament, and people wavered. Still, the very existence of debate, of elections, of newspapers that dared to criticize These were seeds of freedom. Fragile, but alive, planted in soil that had long been barren. The memory of the Rana century lingered, its palaces still standing as monuments to autocracy. But the people's gaze was turning forward. The farmers in their fields, the monks in their monasteries, the artisans carving wood in quiet courtyards were now part of a nation tentatively stepping into a new age. The Himalayas remained eternal, snow peaks glowing in the morning light. But in the valleys below, a transformation was underway. And as the night stretches softly across Nepal in the early 1950s, we can almost hear the murmur of hope rising from Kathmandu's narrow lanes, the songs of students, carrying slogans of democracy and the deep, quiet relief of villagers, who sensed, even if faintly, that the century of shadows had ended. The story was far from over, indeed. Turbulence lay ahead, but the dawn had begun. Gentle and uncertain, over a land long wrapped in silence. When King Mahendra ascended the throne in 1955, Nepal stood at a crossroads, its air filled with both anticipation and uncertainty. The long shadow of Rana autocracy had lifted, and a fragile democracy was trying to take root. Yet the soil was rocky, the institutions frail, and the balance between monarchy and parliament uncertain. Mahendra, intelligent and ambitious, saw himself as more than a constitutional monarch. He envisioned a Nepal not simply guided by parties and elections, but by his own hand, shaped into stability through what he believed was a uniquely Nepali path. The world was changing swiftly around him. India, just across the border, was consolidating its democratic experiment under Nehru. China, to the north, had absorbed Tibet into its territory in 1950, placing a new and powerful neighbor at Nepal's doorstep. The United States and the Soviet Union were deepening their rivalry, and Nepal, perched between India and China, became a quiet chessboard for their influence. Foreign aid, once unknown, began flowing in, with schools, hospitals, and roads appearing as signs of a modernizing state. But with aid came pressure, and with pressure came the question: which way would Nepal lean? For a few years after Mahendra's coronation, Nepal experimented with parliamentary democracy. Political parties, especially the Nepali Congress, attempted to steer governance. But frequent changes of government, infighting, and corruption weakened their credibility. Mahendra watched closely, concluding that the young democracy was disorderly, vulnerable, and perhaps ill-suited for Nepal's traditions. In 1960, he made a decisive move. With the army on his side, Mahendra dissolved parliament, banned political parties, and arrested Prime Minister Bishweswar Prasad Koirala along with other leaders. The king declared that the party system had failed and that a new order was needed. In its place, he introduced the panchayat system, a pyramid of councils that stretched from the village to the national level, designed to give people representation without political parties. On paper, it looked democratic, but in reality, the king held supreme power, with the panchayats functioning as carefully controlled channels of governance. The panchayat system carried with it the language of tradition. Panchayat, meaning a council of 5 elders, evoked village assemblies that had long been part of local life in South Asia. Mahendra presented his model as a homegrown alternative to Western-style democracy, something rooted in Nepal's soil rather than imported from outside. At its core, however, it was a system that concentrated power in the hands of the king. For many, life under the panchayat system was a mixture of continuity and change. Political dissent was suppressed, opposition parties forced underground or into exile. Yet, at the same time, the state expanded schools, roads, and development projects, often with the help of international aid. Literacy slowly climbed. New highways connected the valley to the plains, and the image of the king was promoted as a benevolent father figure guiding his people. The Cold War rivalry brought both opportunities and tensions. Nepal became one of the few countries to receive aid from both the United States and the Soviet Union, as well as from China and India. At Kathmandu, one could see American-built schools and hospitals, Soviet-built factories, and Chinese-constructed roads, all existing side by side. Each superpower sought influence, but Mahendra skillfully played them against each other, ensuring that Nepal remained officially non-aligned, open to all, but beholden to none. This balancing act preserved Nepal's independence, but also meant the kingdom was constantly navigating pressures from every side. Meanwhile, society itself was shifting quietly. The opening of roads and the arrival of foreign visitors began to erode Nepal's isolation. The first Western trekkers wandered into the Annapurna region, enchanted by the landscapes and the warmth of village life. Mountaineering, already legendary after the conquest of Everest in 1953, brought international attention, and with it, a trickle of tourism that would grow steadily in the decades to come. For villagers who had never seen a foreign face, the sight of travelers with cameras and backpacks was both strange and fascinating. In the cities, education expanded, creating a small but growing middle-class students. Teachers, civil servants who were exposed to ideas from abroad. Radios played voices from Delhi, Calcutta, and beyond, while newspapers carried cautious debates within the bounds allowed by the monarchy. Beneath the surface calm, however, discontent simmered. Exiled parties, especially the Nepali Congress, continued to campaign against the panchayat system from across the border. Underground networks spread leaflets, whispered about democracy, and dreamed of change. He was a patron of literature and arts, writing poems under the pen name Malla Shah. He spoke of nationalism and development, and indeed, during his reign, Nepal saw significant modernization. Yet he ruled with an iron grip, unwilling to share real power with political parties. To many rural villagers, he remained a distant yet protective figure, his portraits displayed in schools and offices. To the politically active, however, he was a monarch who had strangled democracy just as it was beginning to grow. The 1960s and early 1970s thus unfolded under this careful balance of development and repression. International visitors marveled at Nepal's landscapes and temples, while Nepalists themselves grappled with a system that gave them representation without real choice. The panchayat councils met, budgets were debated, and roads were laid. Yet everyone knew that ultimate authority rested with the palace. In 1972, King Mahendra's reign came to a sudden end. While on a hunting trip in the Terai, he suffered a heart attack and passed away. His son, King Birendra, ascended the throne, inheriting both the panchayat system and the contradictions it carried. Birendra was young, educated abroad, and seen as gentle in demeanor. But he was stepping into a world where the pressures of modernization, political dissent, and Cold War rivalries would only intensify. As the night deepens in our story, we can almost picture the Kathmandu Valley of the 1960s, the glow of kerosene lamps in quiet homes. Students huddled over textbooks in newly built schools, and the towering image of the king gazing down from posters, his face a symbol of both guidance and control. Beyond the valley, roads stretched toward the plains, buses rattling along them for the first time, carrying merchants, farmers, and curious travelers. The Himalayas, eternal and unmoved, watched silently as a kingdom balanced precariously between tradition and change, isolation and global currents, monarchy and the faint memory of democracy. When King Birendra took the throne in 1972, the mood of Nepal was cautiously expectant. He was young, only in his late 20s, and had been educated abroad in places as varied as Eton in England, Harvard in the United States, and the University of Tokyo. These experiences gave him a broad outlook, and many hoped he would bring fresh winds into the tightly managed world of the panchayat system. Birendra was gentle in demeanor, soft-spoken, and known for his thoughtful nature. He was also deeply aware of the immense responsibility placed upon him. Ruling a country nestled between India and China, courted by global powers and bound by traditions that stretched back centuries. In the early years of his reign, he seemed to embody stability, a monarch who valued modernization, but who also sought to maintain harmony. One of his most notable early moves came in 1975, when he proposed Nepal as a zone of peace. In a world torn by Cold War rivalry, Birendra envisioned Nepal as a neutral sanctuary, shielded from foreign interference, a buffer where peace could be preserved amidst powerful neighbors. More than 100 countries eventually endorsed this proposal. Though key neighbors, India especially, withheld support, cautious of how it might affect their influence. Still, the idea reflected Birendra's desire to secure Nepal's independence on the global stage. At home, however, the panchayat system continued to dominate life. Political parties remained banned, dissent monitored, and the king held ultimate authority. Development projects expanded. Roads climbed into the hills. Hydroelectric plants dotted rivers, and education spread further into rural regions. Yet these advances were uneven. Villages in remote districts still struggled with poverty, illiteracy, and lack of access to healthcare. A gap widened between the growing urban middle class and the rural majority. Discontent began to stir more openly, especially among students and young intellectuals. In 1979, Kathmandu erupted in student protests. The movement began with demands for better education and resources, but quickly expanded into a broader critique of the panchayat system itself. Demonstrations filled the streets, campuses echoed with chants, and the security forces cracked down harshly. Dozens of students lost their lives, and many more were injured. The air in the valley, usually filled with the scent of incense and temple bells, now carried the smoke of tear gas and the cries of youth demanding freedom. The protests shook the monarchy to its core. King Birendra, recognizing the depth of unrest, made a concession. He announced a national referendum, giving the people a choice between continuing the reformed panchayat system or embracing a multi-party democracy. The referendum, held in 1980, was the first of its kind in Nepal's history. Campaigns unfolded across the country, villagers gathering in courtyards to listen to debates, students handing out leaflets, and posters appearing on Kathmandu's walls. When the results were announced, the panchayat system was declared the winner, but by a narrow margin. The outcome was clouded by allegations of manipulation and government pressure. Still, Birendra promised reforms, allowing for some loosening of controls and greater participation within the panchayat framework. For a time, the tensions eased, but the demands for genuine democracy had not disappeared. They had only been postponed. The 1980s unfolded with these contradictions simmering beneath the surface. Nepal saw progress in tourism as trekkers and mountaineers poured into the Himalayas, their journeys bringing revenue and international recognition. Kathmandu, once a quiet city of temples and narrow alleys, became a hub of foreign travelers, hippies, and seekers drawn by the promise of spiritual wisdom. Guest houses multiplied, shops filled with Tibetan carpets and silver jewelry, and the rhythms of traditional newer life now mingled with the sounds of foreign guitars and global chatter. Yet, alongside this openness, the political atmosphere remained controlled. Dissidents were still watched, activists detained, and underground parties continued their work in secrecy. Across the border, in India, exiled leaders plotted and waited, convinced that the panchayat system would not endure forever. The late 1980s brought sharper challenges. Nepal's delicate relationship with India, strained after trade and transit disputes in 1989, leading to a blockade that choked the landlocked kingdom's economy. Shortages of fuel, medicine, and goods spread across the country, and frustration deepened. For many ordinary Nepalis, the hardships underscored the failures of the panchayat system to protect their livelihoods. By 1990, the moment of reckoning arrived. A coalition of forces led by the Nepali Congress and the United Left Front launched what became known as the Jana Andolan, the People's Movement. From March onward, waves of demonstrations swept across Nepal, not just in Kathmandu, but in towns and villages far from the capital. Protesters carried banners, shouted slogans, and demanded the restoration of multi-party democracy. Security forces responded with arrests, beatings, and gunfire. Yet, the people did not retreat. The capital city became the epicenter of resistance. Streets once filled with vendors and pilgrims now rang with defiant chants. Students clashed with police in narrow lanes. Workers left their shops to march. And women, too, joined in vast numbers, their voices rising in determination. Blood was spilled, lives lost, and the air hung heavy with both sorrow and resolve. King Birendra, watching from his palace, faced a choice. The movement was too widespread to be crushed without immense violence, and international pressure was mounting. India, the United States, and others urged a political solution. After weeks of turmoil, in April 1990, Birendra made a historic decision. He lifted the ban on political parties, dissolved the panchayat system, and agreed to the drafting of a new constitution. The streets erupted in celebration. Bells rang from temples, crowds embraced in relief, and songs of victory echoed against the valley hills. Nepal was to become a constitutional monarchy with real multi-party democracy restored after 3 decades in exile. The Nepali Congress, led by Krishna Prasad Bhattarai, took the reins of the new government, and the drafting of the 1990 Constitution began. It was a profound moment, filled with both triumph and uncertainty. For the first time in centuries, real political power seemed to belong to the people. The monarchy remained, but now it was constitutional, its authority limited. Political parties returned to the open air. Newspapers flourished with debate, and the people of Nepal tasted a freedom they had long been denied. As the lamps glowed in Kathmandu that spring of 1990, one could almost hear the exhale of a nation long held in tension. Villagers lit fires in celebration. Students filled the streets with songs, and even in the quiet monasteries of the Himalayas, monks understood that a great turning had come. Yet beneath the joy lay questions. Could this new democracy survive? Could old habits of power be left behind? Could a fragile kingdom, perched between giants, balance the dreams of its people with the storms of its politics? The answers would unfold in the years to come, years of both promise and profound tragedy. The early 1990s in Nepal shimmered with a glow of newfound freedom. The 1990 Constitution, born from the people's movement, promised a balance between monarchy and democracy. Political parties flourished, newspapers multiplied, and the people, long silenced, could now raise their voices. The streets of Kathmandu buzzed with debates, tea shops echoed with talk of elections, and posters of candidates filled walls that once only bore the king's image. In 1991, Nepal held its first general elections in 3 decades. Voters lined up in villages and towns, their fingers inked as they cast ballots with a sense of pride and anticipation. The Nepali Congress, led by Krishna Prasad Bhattarai, emerged victorious, and the hopes of a new democratic age seemed to blossom. It was a moment of genuine possibility when the promise of democracy appeared tangible, alive in the laughter of students and the optimism of farmers. Yet the path ahead was rocky. Nepal's political parties soon fell into the same traps of division and rivalry that had weakened earlier attempts at governance. Governments rose and fell in rapid succession. Coalitions fractured, prime ministers changed frequently, and corruption began to seep into the system. The optimism of 1990 dimmed as ordinary people saw little improvement in their daily struggles. For in the villages and hills where the majority of Nepalis lived, life remained marked by hardship. Poverty was widespread, literacy rates lagged, and health care was scarce. In remote districts, roads were still few, and many families lived with little connection to the promises being made in Kathmandu. Inequality stretched deep into the fabric of society, with marginalized groups, Dalits, women, ethnic minorities, often left out of the political process. Out of this discontent, a new and radical force began to rise. In 1996, the Communist Party of Nepal, Maoist, launched a people's war. Inspired by Mao Zedong's strategies in China and fueled by frustration with corruption and inequality, the insurgency began with attacks on police posts in rural districts. At first, it seemed small, a flicker of violence in the distant hills. But soon it spread, village by village, district by district, until the entire countryside was touched by the red flame of revolt. The Maoists promised to overthrow the monarchy, dismantle the old order, and create a republic of equality and justice. They spoke to the grievances of the poor, the landless, and the excluded. For many villagers, their words carried weight, for promises from Kathmandu had often gone unfulfilled. The rebels collected taxes, enforced their own rules, and created shadow administrations in the areas they controlled. Songs of revolution echoed in the hills, carried by young fighters who had traded farming tools for rifles. The state, alarmed, responded with force. The army and police launched operations to crush the insurgency, but the rugged terrain of Nepal's steep valleys, dense forests, and hidden trails made it nearly impossible to contain. Skirmishes turned into battles, ambushes into massacres. Villages became caught in the middle, accused by one side of collaboration, punished by the other for disloyalty. Families fled, lives were uprooted, and fear spread across the land. Meanwhile, the monarchy still loomed large. Though its role had shifted since 1990, King Birendra, widely respected for his humility and moral authority, remained a stabilizing figure even as the politicians quarreled. Many Nepalis saw him as a symbol of unity, someone who transcended party politics. Yet his constitutional role limited his ability to intervene directly, and as the Maoist war escalated, his kingdom slipped into deeper turmoil. By the late 1990s, the violence had claimed thousands of lives. Roads, once bustling with traders, grew silent. Schools closed in contested areas, and the countryside became a landscape of suspicion and fear. In Kathmandu, the government appeared paralyzed, unable to either fully negotiate with the Maoists or decisively defeat them. Aid organizations warned of humanitarian crises, yet the war dragged on. And amidst this growing storm, a tragedy of unimaginable scale was about to strike at the very heart of the monarchy. In the evening of June 1st, 2001, the royal family gathered at the Narration Palace for a customary dinner. Among them was Crown Prince Dipendra, educated abroad but known for his struggles with family approval regarding his choice of bride. That night, in circumstances still shrouded in mystery and pain, Dipendra opened fire on his own family. When the gunfire ceased, King Birendra, Queen Aishwarya, and many members of the royal family lay dead. Dipendra himself, critically wounded, was declared king while in a coma, only to die days later. The nation was stunned. Shock rippled through the streets of Kathmandu. Crowds gathered outside the palace, weeping, chanting, demanding answers. How could such horror unfold within the sacred walls of the monarchy, the institution long seen as the guardian of Nepal's soul? Rumors swirled, conspiracy theories flourished, but the pain was raw and undeniable. The monarchy, once revered almost as divine, had suffered a wound that would never heal. Onto the throne stepped King Gyanendra, Birendra's younger brother. Unlike his predecessor, Gyanendra lacked the same moral authority and popularity. His rule began in the shadow of tragedy, and the kingdom he inherited was already fractured by civil war. Trust in a monarchy, once unshakable, was shaken deeply, and the new king faced the daunting task of restoring both order and faith. But the insurgency raged on. By the early 2000s, the Maoists controlled large swaths of the countryside. The state responded with harsher measures, declaring states of emergency, expanding military operations, and suspending civil liberties. The conflict became a full-scale civil war, with atrocities committed on both sides. Torture, disappearances, extrajudicial killings. Once seen as a peaceful Himalayan kingdom, now bore the scars of brutal conflict. And yet, through all the darkness, ordinary life persisted. Farmers still tilled their fields, monks still lit butter lamps in hidden monasteries. Children still played in dusty courtyards. The Himalayas, silent and eternal, looked down upon a land torn between old traditions and violent upheaval. The clash of ideology, monarchy, and democracy was no longer an abstract struggle, it was lived daily. In fear, in grief, and in an unyielding hope that peace might someday return. The dawn of the 21st century found Nepal in turmoil. Its wounds raw from both civil war and the grief of the 2001 royal massacre. Onto the throne came King Gyanendra, Birendra's younger brother, a man of sharp confidence and a more assertive manner than his late sibling. But where Birendra had been revered for humility, Gyanendra was met with suspicion. His accession, shadowed by unanswered questions about the massacre, left the monarchy's once sacred aura shaken. The kingdom he inherited was already fractured. The Maoist insurgency had spread like wildfire, transforming from scattered ambushes into a nationwide conflict. By 2000, 2000s had perished, villages were emptied, and fear haunted the valleys. The rebels had established their own people's governments in areas they controlled, collecting taxes, enforcing laws, and running schools under their banner. They spoke of ending monarchy, of creating a republic, of dismantling feudal structures that had long defined Nepali life. Gyanendra, unlike Birendra, was not content to play the role of a symbolic monarch. He believed he alone could save the kingdom from collapse. In 2002, citing political instability, he dismissed the elected government. Over the following years, his interventions deepened, and by 2005, he took direct control of the state, suspending parliament, imposing censorship, and ruling by decree. Soldiers filled the streets of Kathmandu, curfews were imposed, and voices of dissent were silenced. The king framed his takeover as a necessity, a way to crush the Maoists and restore order. Yet, instead of calming the storm, his move only intensified it. Political parties, already weary of the king's interference, now united in opposition. The Maoists, too, saw in his authoritarianism an opportunity to rally greater support. Ordinary Nepalis, caught between state crackdowns and rebel violence, grew weary of both crown and gun, yearning simply for peace. The international community, once respectful of Nepal's monarchy, began to turn away. India, the United States, and European nations condemned Gyanendra's seizure of power, cutting aid and urging a return to democracy. Inside Nepal, civil society stirred with renewed energy. Students, journalists, labor unions, and women's groups filled the streets with protests, even in the face of batons and bullets. The quiet lanes of Kathmandu, usually filled with the smell of spices and incense, now echoed with chants of resistance. Meanwhile, the Maoists were gaining ground. They enforced their own courts, levied taxes, and carried out political indoctrination. Yet, the cost was high. Villagers often found themselves trapped, punished by the rebels for disloyalty and by the army for suspected collaboration. The war had consumed more than 13,000 lives and displaced countless families. The nation's soil, so often associated with the serenity of the Himalayas, was stained with grief. Then, in 2006, a turning point arrived. Political parties, once fragmented, joined hands with the Maoists in a historic alliance. Together, they launched the April People's Movement, known as Jana Andolan II. 4 weeks. Nepal's streets swelled with millions of protesters. Old and young, villagers and city dwellers, students and monks, they marched, defying curfews, facing tear gas and bullets. The king's grip weakened with each passing day, his palace surrounded by a sea of voices demanding an end not only to his rule, but to the monarchy itself. At last, overwhelmed by the scale of resistance and under-intertalented, on April 24, 2006, he restored Parliament, ending his direct rule. It was a watershed moment. The monarchy's aura, already dimmed, was now broken beyond repair. The people had shown that even a king could be forced to bow before their collective will. In the aftermath, negotiations with the Maoists intensified. In 2006, the Comprehensive Peace Accord was signed, formally ending the decade-long civil war. The Maoists agreed to lay down arms, joining the political mainstream, while the army was confined to barracks under United Nations supervision. For the first time in modern history, Nepal stood on the threshold of peace, fragile but possible. But peace brought with it profound transformation. In 2007, an interim parliament declared Nepal a secular state, ending centuries of official Hindu monarchy. The following year, after elections to a constituent assembly, a historic decision was made. On May 28, 2008, the assembly voted to abolish the monarchy entirely. The Shah dynasty, which had reigned since 1768, came to an end. King Gyanendra, stripped of his crown, quietly left the palace and retreated into private life. The scene was both surreal and momentous. Crowds filled the streets, not in mourning, but in celebration. Fireworks lit the sky, drums echoed, and villagers embraced one another in joy. The monarchy, once regarded as divine, was now consigned to history. In its place, Nepal became a federal democratic republica, new chapter in its long and turbulent story. Yet the end of monarchy did not erase the complexities that lay ahead. The Maoists, now part of government, struggled to transition from revolution to administration. The drafting of a new constitution faced hurdles, delayed by disagreements among parties over federalism, inclusion, and the balance of power. Ethnic and regional groups demanded recognition, and a fragile peace was tested repeatedly. The Nepal of 2008 was not the kingdom of old, but a republic born from the will of its people, shaped by their struggles, their sacrifices, and their unyielding demand for dignity. From the quiet valleys of the Himalayas to the crowded streets of Kathmandu, the whispers of centuries had given way to the loud, insistent voice of democracy. And through it all, the mountains stood silent, their snow peaks gleaming as they always had, witnesses to kings and rebels, to tragedies and triumphs. The Himalayas had seen kingdoms rise and fall, dynasties flourish and crumble. And now they watched as Nepal stepped into a new era, certain, fragile, but filled with possibility.